And welcome to Iona Lee's book launch. Let's have a round of applause to start everything off. Yay. Fantastic. I'm delighted to be chairing this event today with Iona. We're going to have time to ask Iona all sorts of questions in just a second. So I keep your thinking caps on, and yes, we will obviously be delighted for having any questions in just a second. However, Iona is now going to read to us from this great book, her first book, Anamnesis. And so, Iona.
Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Can you hear me if I'm here, or should I hold the microphone? Hold the microphone. I can do that. I have two hands. So I thought I would begin at the beginning. It's generally a good place to start. The beginning of this book, I should say, Anamnesis. The opening poem of the book. There are many things that I was unsure of in this process, but something I was always sure of was that this would be the opening poem of the book. It is sort of the mission statement in a way. It's about Paul Klee, the artist, one of my favorites. He was a teacher at the Bauhaus. And because he was a teacher, there's lots of good quotes from him. He was a very philosophical artist, quite spiritual. His most famous quote is where he describes drawing as taking a dot for a walk. And I draw, that's part of what I do as well. I did the cover, for example. And so I thought about that a lot and was also then thinking that poetry, writing poetry could be taking a thought for a walk. You tend to sort of set out unenlightened when you write a poem. You have a thought and then you walk with it and you end up somewhere often that you didn't expect. And this poem is called Taking a Thought for a Walk. And when I was at art school, one of the lecturers told us that Paul Klee described his studio as being like a garden, which means that he would have several paintings on the go at any one time. And in the morning, he would go in and he would tend to them all individually, and he would see what each one needed that day. So one needs a bit of blue. This one needs to be turned upside down. And subsequently, they would all sort of grow together. And I'd lodged that in my brain. I thought, jackpot, that'll be a nice poem one day. And when it came time to write this poem, I was researching and I couldn't find any evidence of this anywhere. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not true necessarily, but part of me does wonder if I made it up. And that's what the poem is about, I suppose, and the book, about memory's unreliability and how memory itself can be a creative practice. So this is called Taking a Thought for a Walk. In art school, I was told that Paul Klee described his studio as being like a garden. At least, this is something that I recall. When I was 4, I watched the tattered bath mat reclining like a gutted glove puppet on the cork floor and thought to myself, I will remember this. Somehow, I still do. I read somewhere that we walk through life backwards. Words are not necessarily true just because they sound good. Nevertheless, I believe in the poetry of that, like I believe in a painting's horizon. I have watched my home receding through the slow rearview mirror of a car. I know how distance causes scenes to coalesce and flatten. Yet, some instants glint, distinct as street lamps, don't they? So for poetry's sake, let's say that it is true, that every morning after breakfast, Klee would visit his studio to see, in the subtle tilting of a new light, what each piece needed to grow. Abstract art is meaningless as music. For Klee, color was mystical, and over time his once depictive paintings disassembled themselves, fragmenting cadmium yellow and cobalt blue into a peculiar Eden. So this is sort of a literary affair, right? And sometimes at literary things, people don't clap between the poems, but I'm a spoken word poet, so I'll cry if you don't clap between. Um, so the next poem I thought I would read, it's sort of also at the beginning. I was raised in the theatre. That does not mean I was a theatre kid. I need to make that clear. I didn't do drama. I literally was raised backstage in theatres. My esteemed parents, hello, are both actors. And what that meant was I saw behind the curtain. I was given privileged access to the inner workings of the backstage of a theatre. And I imagine that's at least partly to blame for my interest in the themes of truth, the way that you see these worlds created and then they disappear forever. So this poem is about that. It's called 1,000 Little Lives, about what that was like as a child, living on tour at times, being in theatres, but also because we lived in so many places, I found it interesting that I've got all these vague memories of different places, and they are almost like backdrops themselves, almost like theatre sets. So at the end, I mention a landing that was at the rehearsal studios of Pitlochry Festival Theatre, where they used to rehearse. And I would always be there because they were too cheap to get childcare, I guess. So I'd just be hanging about. And they would keep all of their prop flowers on this landing in the rehearsal studio. And it was up this, in my memory, incredibly tall ladder. It was probably like 5 foot, but I was small. And I was allowed to climb it, and I would just hang out in amongst all the prop flowers, pretending I was a fairy. So that's where we are at the end of this. I was young and unaware in that most blissful way. Ballachulish, Ullapool, touring with my parents. Exeter, Pittenweem, a flock of half-remembered stops, town halls and little theatres, Iona, Isla, Mull. Precocious fabricator, I would tell my fellow children that mum and dad were tigers in a travelling show or on the run. In truth, they were 1,000 fleeting things, kings and matchmakers and murdered. There was the cold, damp cottage in Pitlochry, the eerie flat in Hackney, where night fell close as a garnet curtain. And all the way up a ladder was a landing, heavy with fake flowers, the harvest of some factory in a land far, far away. I remember it like a garden, painted and unreal, where plastic petals bowed to the weight of glued-on dewdrops, frozen in tableau, the whole world holding its breath, so still and silver in the bewildering light of a dozen moons. Thank you. This does feel a bit like I've invited you all to my birthday party and I've made you all sit and listen to me. Anyway, I alluded to, it just sounds like something I would do. I alluded there to being a bit of a fibber as a child, and I would tell lies quite a lot. I think a lot of writers do. Did you tell lies as a child? No? Okay, never mind. I think it's because you're just figuring out that you've got this thing called an imagination. So you are playing around with it and making stuff up. I grew out of it, luckily, I promise, for the most part. But I have known a few grown-ups in my time who haven't grown out of it. And I find them kind of fascinating as people, actually, compulsive liars. I think they're interesting. I also think I'm probably interested in them because I think that could have been me if things hadn't been different. So I had to put in a poem about telling lies. And that is this. It's called Gallus. 1. Jodie at dancing had a bit of an identity problem. She would arrive every lesson with another story. She was a princess in Africa. She was modeling for Chanel, draped along the back seat of a limousine, wetting the end of a cigarette. I had my doubts. But if you ever caught her in a lie, she would just laugh and shrug with this grand carelessness and slip the trap. You've got to respect that. 2. My flatmate's granddad kept dying. He died at least 3 times, always just after we had asked her to move out on account of the stealing. Boy, could that girl construct an outfit from my stuff. It was around then that Glow and I met this photographer from Argentina. We found her in the smoking area of a pop-up bar. She told us she had tumors in her leg. 3 weeks to live. I didn't even flinch. We walked her home, posing for her camera, our high-heeled shadows stumbling on ahead. It was the wee small hours of the morning. At the bottom of the hill, we all lay down in the road. 3. Once, swinging on the swings in Nielsen Park, feeling exquisitely feminine in my new beret, I told a mother with a buggy that I was from Paris. Comment ça va? She asked, which I hadn't seen coming. Sure, I still lie sometimes. Why shouldn't I? Self is a collaborative construct. If you ask me if I've ever seen The Godfather, I'm hardly going to say no. I keep feeling like you're going to have a shot after. So I'm prone to existentialism, you may have noticed. I like ephemeral subject matter, numinous things. One of the things I was doing in order to write this book, Anamnesis, was I was practicing doing morning pages. So you wake up and you write immediately every day, because I find writing really difficult. It's not easy. It's not breezy. It's kind of hard work. I found a lot of this process quite difficult. So I'm glad it's done for now. But this poem is the last poem that I wrote right before I said, right, that's everything that's in the book. And it did actually just sort of fall out of me. And that was because of doing this morning pages thing. And it just really taught me like the importance of actually just doing it all the time. And when you do something creative, just making yourself do it. Because you want to be, I think I heard someone say this on the radio the other day, this isn't mine, but you want to be at your desk when inspiration strikes. You don't want to be somewhere else. I think that was Picasso that said that. Anyway, so this is called Notation. And it was the end result of these weird sort of writings when you're like half asleep, half awake, and you're surfing that line between the two spaces. When I wake, I keep my eyes closed to keep the dream in. A forest full of butterflies, eyes opening, butterflies everywhere. What woke me? The occasion of thought, then a bus pulling up outside, suspension in the key of A, sustained, a semi-breathe, a bow on strings. I take a pen and make a note of it. I'd half expected the outsobbing of a song, an overture, opening the day, imagined everybody singing, mouths opening like morning birds. Oh, mouth, the first musical instrument. I write, try to pin something down. Each letter is a note in language's songbook, and this morning's gathered notes into a tune that goes butterfly, bus stop, radio. Reader, the morning mind is gathering, and morning is an orchestra tuning to the A. What subtle and confusing music. These openings in time's enclosure. tuning between the channels on a radio, the notes between the keys, thoughts as soft as butterflies. So as of November, I will have been doing this for 10 years. Thanks. I started quite young. Did someone in the restaurant just cheer? I was 17 when I started doing spoken word poetry. So yeah, this year is my 10-year anniversary. And if you're into decimal systems, it's quite satisfying that the first book came out 10 years later. Anyway, now, for anyone here who might be interested in the profession of young female poet, I've got a warning for you, because there is a hazard of the job, and that is that men will send you poetry unsolicited. Not him. He's a nice one, don't worry. No, men I've never met, for example. I solicit your poetry. Yeah. This is
That's good to know.
Yeah. No, this is unsolicited. It's sort of like dick pics, but of the soul. Yeah. So anyway, this is called On Receiving Unsolicited Poetry from Men That I Have Never Met. Question for you. Where does the internet end and a mind begin? The deep cavern that divides 2 hours, hearts, strangers, bridged, eliminated. As if Keats himself had just burst in and flashed me. They glisten in my inbox, expectant, feathered, waiting. For what, exactly? My adulation, I suppose, but I could be anyone, really, inanimate as I am. Allow me to slip into something inconspicuous. One man wrote to tell me that his favorite word was devour, which made me feel digestible. I wonder, had he ever told anyone that before? Had it been devouring him? Or he it, silently dining on devour's fricatives and long vowels, wolfy, toothsome, along the bladed edge of his tongue, as the 2 young sons who smile apathetically in his avatar nibble at their quiet breakfast. Another said that he had paused the Tour de France just to send me the one about Van Gogh's missing ear. He had an English degree from a good university. What do I have? All the time in the world. And this bloody ear that doesn't belong to me. Okay, so I think this is the best poem I've ever written, so I'll be retiring now. This is called Lifting the Skirt, and it was inspired by my time on the Isle of Iona, the island that's named after me. They have Sheila and a gig there, and I hadn't heard of them before, and I'm into general stony, uncanny, arcane things, so I got very into Sheila and a gigs. Now, for those of you who don't know what Sheila and a gigs are, they are grotesques carved onto the side of Celtic churches. You find them in Scotland, most are in Ireland, some in England, some in France. A lot of them were destroyed by the Victorians, and that is because what they show is a smiling figure with a huge vulva. And of course, the Victorians couldn't even handle ankles, so vulvas, far too much. Now, it's not really known what they were for. Some people think they were a warning about how disgusting sex is, but my favorite theory is that they were used to ward off bad spirits. Now, there's another sort of worldwide tradition, I believe, called Anisirma, which is essentially lifting the skirt in order to flash the genitals to scare off approaching armies. or just to cause shock and subsequent laughter. There is a Greek demigod called Baubo, who was basically a fanny on legs. And she made a goddess laugh and brought back the spring. So, flash of flesh, sudden as is becomes was, pink as the sun through an ear or russet, wrinkled as the sand's wet fingers, shocking as a cold slap of sea, ruder than the pixiest of wishes, satin as deep kisses with the taste of teeth, robust as my many names. Read between my legs, this locket of splodges, cave dark, calling you back, this numinous plumage hewn in a weird workshop, this monster with cloven hoof and hood kept hidden. I am the goddess of your belly laughs, the good feel, sensory efflorescence. I am the grotesque and happy little instrument, untidy with desire, love spell and soft briar, my only armor against armies, against harm. Okay, one last one from me, and then Colin can ask me some questions. I thought I'd end at the end. This is the last poem in the book, and it's called Bowerbird. A bowerbird is a bird that creates sort of shrines from cool stuff it's found. I really like them. And I wrote it after I had moved house. I move house a lot, I seem to. And I always take all my stupid little things with me everywhere. And it's part of the process of being in a new space that I take everything out and I put them around me. And I think that's because they're my home, my little things. And for a time, the book was going to be called Bowerbird, which was actually your suggestion. So thank you for that. And I grew very attached to that title, but I couldn't have it because Julia Donaldson of the Gruffalo has a book called Bowerbird that came out this year as well. So anyway, I am happy about Anamnesis and I think it's the right title, but I did grieve the loss of Bowerbird as a title. But there is a poem called Bowerbird. August turned to embers and everyone fell apart. Tired bones wind chiming autumn's rattle. It was time to leave, to lay my curiosities around me. Apricot pip, iridescent shell and sea glass, crab claw, button for a long lost jacket. A fortune that reads, look for the dream that keeps coming back in 6 different languages. I don't know what that means, but here is my wisdom. Magic is the art of wishing well. I collect, I always have, pools of cold tea water, words. Lately, it's been mushroom names. Listen, shaggy parasol, amethyst deceiver, the flirt. My friends are all preserving things in glass jars, kombucha and sauerkraut. One day, we will be so healthy. Moth-eaten butterfly wing, wire nest, broken ring, my threadbare treasures. I don't know what I keep saving you for. For something good, I hope. Hopefully something good. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we are going to throw open the floor to questions imminently, but as I have a microphone, I've got a few of my own to ask. So selfishly, I'll ask a few, and then we can get some questions from you all. So I'm sure you all have a lot.
Can I say one thing really quickly? Can I get
Yes.
some more water? Yes. Thank you. The world's driest mouth. Carry on.
Yes. So obviously, writing a first collection is a very big deal for a poet. It's it's a very kind of major undertaking. It can lead to all sorts of personal problems, anxieties, fears, for yourself, how did it feel to write your first collection, and how do you feel now it's out in the world?
I feel very vulnerable.
Uh-huh.
I felt two things about the book, and they changed over the course of writing it, because when I first started writing it, it was about 5 years ago. I was 22, and I was like, yeah, I can write a book, no problem. I'll get it to you next week. That's fine. And then during the time that it took me, I sort of grew up and I got better, which meant that I was aware of how not as good I was, you know. So then I was like, oh, actually, it might take me a bit longer than I thought it would. And then it became really terrifying. So at the very start, I was, yeah, there's no problem. I'll have it done any day now. But then it kept taking longer and longer and longer. So thank you, Edward, for waiting. Though I am glad ultimately that I took my time, because I think you can't rush these things, really. I think it's right that it's out now. Again, I'm quite young to be releasing a first collection, but I think that feels right. I think I like that I've written what it is to be young while still being young, rather than I'm not there, so I can't tell you how to take it. So yeah, it definitely feels more vulnerable. Yeah, for sure.
And were there any particular poems in it that you felt, oh well, this is more of a performance poem than a page poem? Were there poems that didn't make it into the book that were performancey more? Or?
Oh, loads, because sometimes these poems exist just in the air and just in your mind, and when you write them down on paper, you're like, oh, maybe we won't include that one. But also, there's nothing wrong with performance poetry. I think sometimes people can be a bit snobby about it, you know, and sort of look down on it. It has its own merits. Both have their own merits. There's a lot that performance poetry can do that page poetry can't, but hopefully you can do a bit of both as well. So there are definitely pieces in the book that when you read them, I think you'll probably notice, thank you very much, that there is a sort of internal rhythm, and I think your brain will start just performing it for itself, perhaps, as well. Yeah. Yeah.
And so did you feel a bit more like you were writing the poems in this book for yourself more than delivering them for an audience? Did you have a sense of a readership? Or
that's a really interesting question. Well done.
It's what you're paying me for.
I have no idea. That was something I was thinking about quite a lot last year. I was doing a master's in philosophy and art, and the idea of who are you talking to? There's a thing in poetry that I learned about and got really into called apostrophe, which is when you have an O, so just like the letter O tree, O sky, you know, that poets do a lot. It's sort of the dramatic poet, where you address something inanimate, sort of so that it becomes a mirror and you're actually talking to yourself. But also maybe you're talking to God. And I got really into that as an idea, sort of, who are you talking to? There's a line in a poem in that book, in my book, Anamnesis, that is, in my poems, I am always alone and talking to myself. I'm a bit solipsistic, perhaps, though I blame that on my dad, because my dad told me what solipsism was when I was about 8. Solipsism, by the way, is the philosophical idea that you can never truly confirm that anyone else exists. And it might all just be a figment of your imagination. So thanks for that, Dad. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm still figuring that out. I'm still figuring out who I'm writing to or for. So maybe come back to me in about 10 or 15 years. I might have a better answer for you.
Great. I'll do that for sure. Yeah, we'll be sitting in this garden. And speaking of gardens, I'm segueing so well into my next question, because you were talking about Paul Klee and about the idea of the him going into his studio, making little adjustments with his paintings and such. Like, I wondered whether you felt like that when you were going through the kind of continuum of the book. Did you find yourself going through making little changes here and there, a little bit like Paul Klee was? Did you feel as if this book is your garden that you were tending to?
Yeah, for sure. And also, gardens are maybe a bit of a theme in the book. I like the idea of thinking of, let's say, memory, consciousness, sentience is like a forest, and it's wild and untamed and dark. And then a garden is sort of like your memories, and you've shaped them and you tend to them. And they're not, this, I'm quoting the book again, they're not nature shaped. You know, you influence the way that they move. So yes, I suppose I did. One thing I noticed that was really fun was that I'm really good at memorizing text. So I actually memorized the whole book by accident, back to front. So when I was trying to sleep at night, I would just start reading the book in my head. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was fun. So when you asked, how do I feel now that it's out? I'm glad I don't do that anymore. Because that was really stressful for like 3 months, just constantly reading the book over and over. And I mean, no one reads their book more than the person who wrote it does, honestly. Like, yeah, wouldn't you say that's true?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's yeah. You got to read it a lot, right? You got to read it over and over and over.
A lot, yeah.
Especially, I think with well, maybe not especially with poems, but certainly with poems, because they're demanding, and you can find sometimes little nooks in them that you've been okay with up until that point, and and this is again why putting out a first collection for a poet is such a big deal, is getting all that stuff right in the page. But it's very interesting hearing how you're how you're working away from the page as well, because this is something that a lot of my own favorite poets would do, would be people making up poems in their head, or not physically writing stuff down. I'm thinking of
well, for me, I didn't study poetry, so in many ways I'm a bit ignorant to a lot of poetry, its history, how it works, the rules that one might break once one knows them, which is why I was